being thought of as one of the great intellectuals of his time. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle became extremely interested in spiritualism and became spiritualism's most ardent supporter. Dropped, and who knows what kind of Sherlock Holmes series would have come had he not dropped everything to run around the world speaking on its behalf. And he called spiritualism the most important movement in the history of the world since the Christ episode. By 1870, spiritualism had, in America alone, 11 million adherents. That's a lot of people who would say that they are spiritualists. And I thought that we would talk a little bit about how this movement evolved, where it got, how it came about, how it was placed in the rest of the history of America, and that Jerry would then introduce you to the cataclysmic moment when the new spiritual movement in America was born as a movement, the Shakers' relationship to it, and then I would take it back to talk about what we know, a little bit about what we know about where it is today. So first of all, what is spiritualism? Well, the definition from the Spiritualist Manual of the National Association of Spiritualist Churches is: spiritualism is a science, philosophy, and religion of continuous life based on the demonstrated fact of communication. Now, listen to that word, demonstrated fact. If you are Christian or Jewish or Hindu or whatever else you might have grabbed onto, no one is asking you to prove your belief. They don't say, you mean you show me how the Red Sea parted, or prove to me that Jesus is the Son of God. They don't really say that to you. They just say, oh, you're Catholic, and just no. But that's kind of what people say to spiritualists. They say, prove it. And that's because spiritualists started by making it clear that they were a scientific enterprise. And so to this day, they're bedeviled by the fact that people are running around saying, prove it. And they believe that the dead survive their physical death as spirit entities. And that these are spirit entities who can communicate with people on earth, and that the people who can help us do that are particularly sensitive to these spirits, and they are called mediums for the most part. And I think in thinking about this, thinking about how the Shakers thought about it, thinking about how people in the past and present have thought about this, we absolutely have to suspend belief. We can't just sit there going, no, prove it. Because then we won't really feel the full flavor of what they are feeling and believing. This idea that you could communicate with the dead is, of course, not new. But it really, as it got momentum as an actual movement, challenged Orthodox Christian beliefs. Here were some of the Orthodox Christian beliefs that it challenged. First, that loved ones lived on in the world. Now, it's not true that Christians didn't think that. Certainly Catholics have thought that. The saints are people who become intercedents for you and God, and Eastern Orthodox religious people believe that. So it's not that they didn't, but in general, Christians didn't. And this was an upsetting idea. The second challenge that was put down went that no matter how sinful you are, you can become redeemed after you're dead if you work on your redemption as a spirit in the spirit world. So if you're willing, the sky's the limit. You're all right. And that was very upsetting to the people who were preaching that wasn't so. The third challenge was that the spiritualists did not believe that the only way to salvation was to accept Jesus as your Savior. Spiritualists were quite tolerant of lots of paths and made it clear that they were. The next is that there was no original sin. This was really upsetting to the Calvinists particularly. This one really blew the lid off. Jesus was an important prophet, but not divine. That was very distressing. Yeah. Heaven and hell do not exist as locations. Also very upsetting. That the Bible wasn't inerrant. That shook some people's foundations. I just, as preparation for today, I've been doing a lot of odd things, but the most recently, this morning, in fact, I finished a film on the early days of Billy Graham, and trying to understand how he perceived heaven and hell, and for him they certainly did exist, and the Bible was true, word for word. The spiritualists did not believe that baptism was a way to cleanse your sins, because of course you were working on it up in wherever you were, not in heaven, or just up there. There is no resurrection, and God has no particular gender or appearance. These were all upsetting ideas spiritualists put out there. Okay. These early adherents worked really hard to prove that spirit communication was real. And this is the first time that any religion had tried to claim that it had a scientific base. And that too was quite surprising. But this was the scientific world. This was a time when science was gaining an ascendancy. In medicine in 1910, everything in medicine would change as Abraham Flexner began to push for a much more scientific base for medicine. And you see professions beginning to form as people wanted to create codifications of law and social work and all sorts of teaching, sorts of things become professionalized, made more scientific. So that was happening. But there's another thing happening at the time that spiritualism comes about. We had in America formed by Calvinists. The Calvinists believed that there was that everybody's pathway had been developed by God, and most of us were going to hell, and there was nothing you could do about it. Actually, you could be good or you could be bad. It didn't actually matter. God had decided your fate, and most of it was bad. I sometimes think of this as a cartoon with people walking around like this, all around America, you know? And
there's a certain relief in that.
There could be relief. There could be a relief.
Don't have to worry about it.
You don't have to worry, and you don't have to think for yourself, and you shouldn't think for yourself unless you're gentry, because the gentry know better. Your betters know better. And that was really the idea there. And then we won the American Revolution. This upset the apple cart, because this idea that you couldn't shape your future didn't make sense to people who just won the American Revolution. We had thrown off one of the biggest, most fearsome, evils in the world. And we were going to create heaven on earth. We, ordinary people. So that philosophy didn't work, and the idea that we ordinary people should be questioning things, that seemed more like it. Hadn't we questioned the very foundation of government? And we did begin to question. We began in New Lebanon to question women's rights, women's place. And here and in all of New York was developed the first women's rights movement out of that questioning. We began to question the role of blacks, and out of that came the abolition movement. We began to question family, and we've seen some family experimenting, for instance, among the Shakers. We began to question what we ate, and out of that grew the vegetarian movement. And we began to question the very role of religion, and out of that grew evangelicalism. Why does a church have to be inside? Why can't it the outside, under God's stars, or under a tent. All of these ideas are bubbling around right here in Lebanon as we speak. And I'm sure in this very room, these ideas were hotly debated and very much a part of things. So in that atmosphere of bubbling, questioning, pushing, pulling, comes this new idea of spiritualism, and comes the Shakers themselves. So I'm going to turn over to Jerry to talk a little bit about what happened in 1848 in Hyde, New York? Hyde Park, or Hyde, New York?
Hydeville.
And,
Not the first of rhythm, but do you want me just to talk about that event, or go back and catch up on the Shakers?
Still on the Shakers, yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
Thanks. Everybody has questions to resolve about what you believe in. I think we're all seekers to some stage. And I was thinking about this in terms of the Shakers, in terms of core beliefs, but they also constructed a theology. And constructing a theology involved questions like, what do you do with the body when you're done with the body? That brings out the question about whether or not there is a physical resurrection at the end of it all, or do you just, dump it over the bank with the leaves? That's because you don't really need it. It's that there's a question of, is Christ within or without? Is he a force on the outside who influences you, or is he an internal dwelling force that influences you? And the question, these are things that that create that build up to a theology. And the question that was interesting with Ruth, and we talked about this a bit before, is that the Shakers questioned whether or not God was male or female or both. And there are many, many more of those kinds of questions you ask in construction about theology. But there's an underlying belief with the Shakers that sort of predates all of that, and that is the question that confounds people: what do you do when all at once you are acted upon by some unseen power, force, voice, apparition, whatever it is? How do you deal with that experience of something happening to you that you cannot explain? And I think back to get back to furniture, a cabinet maker who became a Shaker, a man named David Rowley, who in his account of becoming a Shaker said, I was working on my workbench one day, and my plane, my woodworking plane, started moving as if it wasn't cutting, but I noticed there were shavings coming out of it. But it moved like it was just skipping over the thing. I checked the blade, there was not a chip of wood stuck in it. So, and the shavings were coming out, and I concluded that it must be being acted upon by an unseen force or power. And I think it's those kinds of moments when people have an experience that they can't really explain, and they give it up, to say, something's happening here that I don't know what's going on. And from day one with the Shakers, the thing that defines the group is that they gave it up to the fact that they received revelation, gifts, dreams, visions, however you want to call these things, directly from God. First through Ann Lee, and then through many other Shakers. But all of the early control of how the Shakers ended up being Shakers, and not Methodists or somebody else, ended up being that they felt that experience of direct revelation, and then following those revelations was something that anybody could have, and that it was an important part of how you guided your life and defined what you were and what you did. Some of those revelations for the Shakers were living a celibate life. Some of them were the indwelling Christ spirit. Some were getting out of England and going to America. Some were to live communally together as the apostles had apparently lived. So, those were commands about how the Shakers should proceed and how they should live their lives. So from day one, this is a spiritualist church. I use that word spiritualist loose, but they were ones that were controlled and driven by actions between this world and the spirit world.